Well, the main topics that are on the radar now, of course, I mean, the primary topics are trans issues, trans rights issues, gay marriage. Let me see, what would be a third one? Well, I think, clearly right now, bullying is an issue that's talked about constantly. Um, and I think they're important issues, but I also think that economic justice, social justice, um, sexual liberation issues have been lost a little bit. And I think the the responsibility of a newspaper that um, publishes for the gay community, as should include those issues as well. I mean, there are lots of people who are not in a relationship and don't intend to get married. So if the only thing you talk about is marriage and, quote, gay and lesbian families, you're leaving out people who are single. So it's important to not lose sight of that too. At this conference that I was in, there was a group called Against Equality, and it was a young group of lesbians and gay men who advocate that the community shouldn't be seeking marriage equality because the problem is marriage, period, and the government shouldn't be sanctioning any marriage because it discriminates against single people. So it's just an interesting thing. So I like the idea of covering those issues too. I also think that an issue that affects gay men especially, but gay people generally, that has been completely off the radar screen in the gay press is sex offender registries, which have been causing serious, I think, harm to a number of people without really a concomitant safety to children. It's an issue that really is covered sometimes in the radical press, but is being completely missed in the mainstream gay press. And so, those are really important issues, I think, that should be discussed. Not saying that you shouldn't address some of these other issues too. Another interesting thing is hate crimes, and there's a substantial number of people in our community who are opposed to hate crimes being enhanced as a penalty out of fear that prosecutors will, in some ways coming from a place of having been oppressed by government for centuries, giving the government more authority, may be a problem in some situations. So, I just take a more expansive view of important issues.
One of them was the first attempt at a city council gay rights bill, which was in, I think it's 82. Recall that we were part of a nonprofit organization, and that meant that we could not endorse political candidates. And in fact, we had to be very scrupulously nonpartisan in everything we wrote, lest we endanger the tax status of the center. But we did have the right to report on political issues, certainly. And one of the things we did was to write to all the candidates for office with a series of questions of, do you support gay rights and this issue and the housing and employment, and what are you going to do for the city of Baltimore, blah, blah, blah. And I even remember having one very nice, lengthy, detailed reply that came with Mayor Schaefer's signature at the bottom of it. He was not exactly one of our big supporters, but anybody who wanted to consider voting, he was going to talk to. So that was a big issue, the lead up to it, and which council persons were our friends and which of them weren't, and so on. And of course, Letters the editor had opinions about what we should do and how we should approach the issue. The early issue of the AIDS epidemic, of course, was a major topic. A third major issue the internal politics of the center, which consumed us all, didn't make much presence in the paper, because nobody outside the center really cared whether the president was getting on with the executive director or not. We cared because it affected us, but we didn't write much about that. And so those kinds of issues that were important to us as the newspaper committee did not have much impact on the content of the paper.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, it's not. Well, there was the thing on the prison, and there were multi-ethnic women in the prison. And when we had the dances, those 300 people that would come to those dances that me and my friends PR'd for, we went everywhere. It wasn't just like a bunch of white lesbians that were middle class having a party. We went everywhere. Mitch was throwing us out of the Mitchells. Mitch herself was throwing me out because she didn't want the competition of us, advertising that we were having a dance 2 weeks later. And there were all kinds of people that went to Mitchell's. And so we had, it wasn't like all white ladies partying in Baltimore, because Baltimore has many different ethnicities.
Well, we tried. And this has always been an issue in the Baltimore gay community. There was a lot more de facto segregation of the community in the 70s and the 80s than I think there is today, although there's still a fair amount of de facto segregation in the community. There was an organization, Black and White Men Together, that was devoted specifically to overcoming that, and we certainly covered that. There was the Black Gay Pride Day festivals. We tried to cover those. Actually, one of my saddest recollections was somewhere around 82 or 83. There had been complaints that the paper did not sufficiently represent the black community. And of course our response was always, well, come and write for us and take photographs and send things in and we'll be happy to print them. And one of the things I did was say, well, let's have an open house or a forum, invite everybody from the black community and anybody else wants to show up to talk about how we can change the representation of minorities in the paper, and advertised it for 2 months and scheduled it at the center. And I show up and Reverend Dolores Berry of MCC showed up. That was it. And Dolores and I talked about how unfortunate it was that we couldn't get, everybody liked to complain about it, but nobody seemed to have suggestions about what to do about it. Could we have done a better job? I'm sure we could have. Certainly there was no animosity towards blacks on the part of the paper or the center, as far as I can see, in those days or subsequently. Paulette Young was the first president. Cheryl Parham was president the year after I left the paper. There were a number of black people involved in the center. Not the 70% that one would expect from the demographics of the city of Baltimore, but certainly more than enough to say that there was a participation of the black community.
Well, in the gay paper, we didn't have much in the way of racial news stories, race news stories related. We were a very progressive paper, I know that. We were very much into the civil rights of everybody. But as the case was then, as it is now, to get a perspective of, let's say, the African American community, you need to have African American writers provide that. It has to come from within the community. Fortunately, in my tenure in Baltimore Out Loud, we had as many as 8 different African American writers who were fairly regular, not constantly regular, but would be regularly contributing stories that I think hit the essence of what's going on. We had writers that covered relationships among themselves. We had writers that covered the political consequences of what's going on. We had health issues raised by that. We had we had a transgender African American writer also provided her perspective. So we had a very nice, I would say, good flow of information coming from the African American community, for which we're very proud. Lately, there's been some drop-off in the number of African American writers, so we don't have that perspective right now as we should. We're always looking to recruit, but the thing is, like any situation with any kind of writers, we're not in a position to pay writers yet for their contributions. So people would have to do this as a volunteer, format, and not everyone wants to give them their time or can continue to do so on an extended run like that. They might do it for a couple of issues, see the name in print, they're happy about that, but then they either run out of ideas or they just move on to other things in their lives. And that's not just with African American writers; that's with everybody. So the challenge is to keep them, to retain them, keep them interested, keep all our writers interested in writing about that. And I think if you do have that kind of representation on the paper, then you will have better insight into what's going on in their community, because I think that's where it best comes from, is someone who's in it themselves.
I think that we do, on some level, we could do a better job of it. There's always a balance you have to provide because there's a limited number of pages, really. There's 28 or 32 pages, for instance. And so you want to cover clearly breaking news, hard news. You want to cover the hot, obviously right now with the marriage amendment on the ballot, that you obviously want to cover that issue. But we Out Loud definitely tries to do a little bit more than that, and both in opinion pieces and one of the things that I like to say is I think it's important. Like we put out an issue last fall focusing on the Occupy movement, and I thought that was real important because clearly, the state of the economy has a major impact on all of us, and there was a contingent of gay people there. In the Occupy movement, so we covered that issue. I definitely want to see the paper to continue to have an expansive view of what goes into it. At the same time, I want to cover the mainstream stuff too, because I think it's only fair to do that, especially if you're one of 2 voices, community voices that are being printed. I think we have a responsibility to do that too.